Hello, how's it going? Yeah, so 10 minutes till class time. Just getting the stream started early as usual. And I'm hanging out here with Eddie. You can see that he's getting active with it today. Good boy. Just gonna get myself a little beverage. I'll be right back. Sparkling water. Okay. Yeah. Hey, Leanne. You know what? I want to ask a question. I'm not sure if it's you. I'm gonna go back into my emails and look for something. It might be you. It's someone named Leanne. I'm not sure if there's another Leanne, so I'm gonna double check. Okay, so Leanne, can you see me and hear me right now? Can you just put something in the chat to confirm that? Okay, I sent you an email. I replied to your submission of the essay. You did not properly attach your essay. I do not have your essay. You have to resend it. I don't know what you did, but that link does not work and you can't click on it and it doesn't do anything. So I don't have your essay. I sent you a response. You should be checking your emails. So, I wanted to get your response a little bit sooner, but it's okay. Just send it to me. Can you please resend it? Because obviously I will not be able to give you any grade until I receive your paper, okay? Other than that, there's also Sandra, but I'll wait and see if she comes through. Yeah, can you confirm in your inbox right now, if you're able to, that you see my response? Because yeah, there was absolutely no way to access your file. I'm not sure what happened with it, but it's just a dead link and you can't do nothing with it. Yeah, I just clicked it again. It definitely don't work. Okay, no worries. Yeah, please send it to me. I want to make sure I receive all that. Okay, cool. I'm just looking at my emails. It's good that I saw you here, so I was able to ask during the live. That's nice. Hello, everybody. Hi, Carson, Michelle, Santino, Elena, Jemin, of course, and Jennifer. Good to see everybody. Still have like about 5 minutes until we really get going with our comments here. Okay. Okay, let me check in if I can open. Yes, now I have access to it and I can open it, so thank you. I'm not sure if there was just like a missing letter or something in the text of the link in the first case or whatever, but no matter how many times I clicked on it, it just didn't do nothing. But now I've got it, so not to worry. Thank you so much. I'm glad that we got to resolve that one. No problem. No, it's okay. I totally get it. Just do try to stay on top of the emails for the class and stuff because there's no other way we can be in contact since it's online. But you're all good. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, we still have 4.5 minutes. Eddie's just sitting right here. You can see like just trying to chill with me, but won't be here for too long once the class actually gets started. Hi, Rosemary. What's up, Eddie? Okay, just another 3 minutes. Okay, just another 2 minutes. Hi there, guys. Okay, Sandra. Sandra LVR. Can you hear me? Just let me know in the chat if you can. I have some quick little question for you. Okay, so Sandra, your essay did not properly send. You didn't attach the file correctly, so the link you gave me is dead. I can't do anything with it. It doesn't take me to your essay document. So I need for you to resend your essay. You and Leanne were the two cases of students that had trouble submitting it. I sent you an email response back last Friday, and the email that I sent to you said, please send your essay ASAP. So could you try and resend it in a format that I'm able to access? I'm not sure what happened with it, but I don't have your essay. And so I won't be able to give you your grade until I get it. Okay, Tyler, Natalia, Justin, Jasmine, Violet, Daniel, good to see everybody. Yeah, no worries, Sandra, but like I was saying to Leanne, just try to stay on top of your emails. If you're sending me something, just keep an eye out for my response because I always do send a confirmation back within a couple hours or maybe by the next day at the latest. Okay, Anthony, Julian, Nick, good to see everybody. Good to see all you guys. No, haven't missed anything yet. We haven't started yet. This is just the beginning. What do you mean regarding the essays? Like the fact that they were due last week? I mean, I don't know if you missed that, but that's something that definitely has been clear from the start. What do you mean? Like whether they've been resubmitted or something? I was talking to a different student that had a problem submitting theirs. That was all I was mentioning, but not related to to your case or anything. Okay, so it's 4 o'clock, guys. Good to see you. Welcome back. Hope everybody's doing great and you had a good weekend. And we just continue through our semester. We have a new topic to start on today, but I need to finish off a couple of last leftover elements of the last essay by Gerald Dworkin. So let me just kind of retrace our steps a bit with the Dworkin material, and then we'll continue on to our next topic after that. Okay, Eddie, come on, move along. It's sitting on top of my notebook. Okay, so Gerald Dworkin had this paper called Paternalism from 1972, and he talked about a number of different things. He talked about how the concept of autonomy, meaning having like individual self-determination free of external control, is something that is generally valued by everybody, and that people can make arguments either in favor of criminalization or legalization by making appeal to the concept of autonomy. If you're an advocate of, say, legalization, then it's a pretty straightforward argument to make reference to autonomy. You would just say that if people don't have the freedom to choose whether to use drugs recreationally, mature, reasonable adults can take these chances on their own health and well-being. They should be allowed to do that. If they are prohibited from doing that under the law, then that's a restriction on their liberty and that harms their autonomy. But also, advocates of criminalization can make appeal to the value of autonomy by saying that it's precisely because we want you to retain your free ability to make decisions without external interference that we would criminalize these drugs, because when people become addicted to them, as they may do in greater numbers if they were legally accessible, then in that case, they might have, with the addiction, some damaged capacity to make free decisions, because at that point, like, the drug would be sort of deciding things for them, or they couldn't make a free or rational choice that was inconsistent with the desire to like continue using the drug and feeling its effects. So both pro and con drug arguments can be used with reference to the concept of autonomy. He also talked about the ideas of John Stuart Mill on the topic of libertarianism and paternalism. Mill is a classic libertarian. So that means that he believes that individuals should have maximum individual liberty as long as it's consistent with social order and as long as it doesn't interfere with anyone else's material interests. So he thought that like no person should be capable of telling another adult human being how to run their lives. No one should be able to tell another person what's best for them. They should be able to do as they see fit as long as they're not harming anyone else. But Mill did have this one exception to that general position. Maybe someone here will remember. Mill said that as much as a libertarian as he is, there's one self-regarding action that even he thought people should not be allowed to do. And what would that be, if you can remember? Slavery, yes. A person should not be allowed to freely engage in becoming a slave or becoming a willing slave, because that would eliminate or destroy their autonomy forevermore after that. So it's kind of almost a little bit of a oxymoron or a paradox, but we want you to have maximum freedom, but the one thing that we don't think you should be free to do is to give up your freedom. So he would say that's one thing that he would hesitate to agree with. And then Dworkin uses that concept as a sort of basis to say that at least some forms of paternalism might actually be justified even to a person with feelings and attitudes as libertarian as Mill. He goes into some other distinctions. He talks about the difference between pure and impure paternalism. Pure paternalism being that the set of people benefited by whatever restrictions are the same people who are restricted by those things. Like, for example, a helmet law restricts the freedom of people to ride with no helmet, but it's also intended to prevent harm to precisely those same people. With the impure paternalism, there's a difference between the set of people who are benefited by the restriction and the people who are placed under the restriction. So we talked about an unlicensed medical practitioner. Maybe they'd be willing to provide some kind of medical service for a person at a lower cost than what they would get from a real physician. But even if they had a willing customer, they would be subject to penalties if this was discovered by authorities. The penalty would adhere to the practitioner, but for the benefit of the would-be customer. And he says this can't be assimilated to straightforward cases of preventing harm to others, because in this case, the so-called victim is willing to take the risk, and therefore there's still some kind of setting back of a person's will or decision. Okay, and then we talked about how labor laws that make sure that you can't work more than 40 hours a week without being a recipient of overtime pay, they may seem as though they're paternalistic, but in fact they're not really, because the affected class the workers have all negotiated at the collective bargaining level through unions to bring these employer restrictions on their capacity to enforce excessive hours on people. So he thinks that even though there could be like one kind of random employee that says, I don't want these laws to exist so that I could work for like 70 hours a week without my employers being forced to pay overtime so then I could get more hours. But that's the exception to the general position of most employees that want to have fair and reasonable work hours, otherwise to be paid in addition, an additional sum. Paternalism itself, the interference in a person's liberty that's justified by reasons referring exclusively to their well-being or benefit. Then finally, we get to the cases in which he thinks like paternalism can be justified, and he thinks cases that even a sort of mill figure would be supportive of. One of those three, Jemin, you're saying your Wi-Fi is going down. Not to worry, do whatever you need to do to get your connection established. And if you have to dip out for a minute and come back, that's obviously fine. And you can catch up on your notes later if you need to. But thanks for letting me know. And to everybody else arriving into the chat, good to see you guys like usual. I'm just summarizing for now the material we covered on Thursday about Dworkin's article. I just have a few last leftover points. At the end, he says that there's three basic cases in which a person would be justified in using some kind of paternalistic interference in individual liberty. The first one is when the restriction is necessary to prevent the person from forfeiting their freedom later. And this is supposed to be in alignment with Mill's statement that people should not be free to become a slave. So any kind of restriction on liberty that allows a person to experience more liberty or autonomy in the future, he thinks that that's justified even by libertarian principles or intuitions. So he gives the case of like when we restrict children by not allowing them to like just decide that they don't want to go to school, or not allowing them to just decide that they want to eat candy all day, etc. So when parents or social institutions like the school system impose these rules on the child, we're not giving them the free, unfettered choice as to what they want to do. So their autonomy is in that sense restricted. But it's for the sake of their own full development of autonomy, because if you don't develop basic reading, writing, math skills, and other things that school teaches you, then you'll grow into an adult life where you don't have the capacity to make like fully rational decisions, and you're just kind of impoverished from the standpoint of your intellect. So he thinks that that's one case because it's preservative of your future autonomy, even though it's a temporary restriction on it in the first place. He also thinks a second case in which paternalism could be justified is in a scenario where the person themselves would probably agree with the interference later on. Like say, for example, that the child that we talked about just now, when they become mature adults, they'll probably look back on the actions and conduct of themselves as children and say to their parents, or be willing to say at least that, thank you for putting up with my protests against going to school or against eating, nutritional meals. At that time, I was immature and not fully rational. But now that I am, I can tell you that I thank you later, now at this time instead of back then. So these restrictions into our autonomy, these paternalistic restrictions, he says, they're especially justified, number one, again, when they preserve your future freedom. Number two, when it's the sort of restriction that we imagine that you would give a grant of allowance to when you're later on fully mature and rational. I don't know if I mentioned this case, but like, suppose that someone was going to maybe be willing to drive drunk and you have taken their keys and they're telling you, please don't keep my keys. Those are mine and it's my car. And if I want to get behind the wheel, it's up to me. You might say, well, I'm not going to let you have them because I know right now you're not in your right mind. And you're thinking that later on, when they're sobered up or whatever, they'll be coming back to you and saying, thank you so much for not allowing me to do what I wanted to do at that point in time. At that moment, it seemed like a paternalistic restriction of my freedom, but I wasn't fully rational. And now that I'm of sound mind, I validate the decision that you had made. So when it's necessary to interfere with one's freedom to protect their future freedom, and also, number two, when it's the sort of interference with freedom that they themselves would probably validate in the fullness of time. Now, the third one has to do with if there was prior consent given to the interference by the individual themselves. And I think when I ran out of time, I was going to tell you about the example of Odysseus from Homer's Odyssey. So, like, third case of justified paternalistic interference, I'm going to put that in the chat. So this third case of justified paternalistic intervention or interference into someone's liberty is when that individual themselves that you're intervening on has themselves given prior consent to the interference. And there's an example given to illustrate this point, and it's the example of Odysseus and the sirens. Okay, so little quick crash course on Homer's Odyssey. There's a part of the story where the character Odysseus is charting through these waters in a boat, and he's got a whole crew with him, that are also sailing with him on the boat. Now, what they're going to be doing in the story is they're going to be sailing past this part of the water where there are these mythical creatures known as the sirens. I don't know if you've ever heard about the sirens or you know anything about this. If you have, you can tell me in the chat while I'm just describing this point. But anyway, according to this mythical story, this is obviously fiction, but you're sailing past the sirens in Odysseus's boat. And the thing about the sirens is that the reputation they have is they basically sing this enchanting song, the siren song. And anybody who hears it, if their ears are exposed to the sounds of the sirens, they're kind of described as these, like ladies that are monstrous or whatever, but they have these voices. They sing this beautiful, enchanting song. When people hear it, it captivates them. It makes them desire powerfully to get closer to the sound of the sirens. And so that's how they lure people in, basically. This is like a trap. The sirens put out their call. People that are listening to it hear it, and they're like, oh, that's enchanting. That is, captivating. I need to get closer and closer. They get close to the sirens, and then the sirens basically kill them and eat them. So, this is an element of the myth in the story. Now, Odysseus in the story knows that they're approaching that part of the water where the sirens were reputed to live. So he wants to hear their song. He wants to hear this beautiful sound of the sirens, but he doesn't want to, of course, get killed and eaten. So what he does is he tells his whole crew on the boat, okay, guys, here's what's going to happen. I want you all to stop up your ears with wax so that you can't hear anything, basically like earplugs. And I'm going to leave my ears exposed to the song of the sirens. I want you to tie me to the mast of the boat so that I'm restricted from moving. And let me hear their song. As we're sailing past them, I just want to listen to it. I want to be a person who heard the sirens and survived to tell the story. But here's the thing, he says. When we start sailing past them, my mind is going to be all, messed up from hearing their song. And what I'm going to start saying to you at that time is going to be stuff like this. Hey, never mind. Release me from this mast, untie me, and then, let's get closer to them. He already knows in advance that once he starts hearing that song, he's going to have his mind transformed, and he's going to start pleading and begging to, get close to them, basically. So he knows that, and he's got the foresight to tell his crew, once I start saying these things, you have a direct order from me right now not to listen to me. Don't act on my desires and requests at that point in time, because that's not going to be really me expressing my full rational will. Right now, I am fully rational, and I'm telling you the truth. This is expressive of my desire. I want to hear the sirens, but if I start saying things like, let me get over there and let's go closer, please, you need to decline to follow the order, okay? So anyway, as it happens, as you could probably guess, they get close enough to the sirens where he starts hearing them. And then just as he predicted, he starts saying stuff to the other crew members. Hey, guys, what did I say before about not letting me get close? Never mind that. I just want to get really close to these sirens. Let's go. Bring me over there. And at this point in time, what they have to do is not comply with his requests, because they already know that before, he told them this is inevitably going to happen. And when it does, I don't want you to listen to me at that point in time. So this is a third possible scenario where, according to Dworkin, most reasonable readers would probably agree that it's a justified case of paternalistic interference, because the people that are not allowing him to act on his desires, like his crew, just if you took a snapshot of time and you're looking at that moment, you would say, okay, well, they're restricting his freedom. He wants to do something and they're not letting him do it for his own benefit. So they're being paternalistic to him. And maybe they are, but it seems like it's justified, right? According to the author's analysis, and he thinks the reader will probably side with that it becomes justifiable in this case because previously consent was given to the interference. Another possible example of that is suppose that we, the voters, received a proposition in an election that says we want to raise taxes to generate more funding for Cal State University. In fact, we did do that in California in the mid-2010s. Now, when you go and you vote, you're like, I know that when I cast this vote, if it passes, then I'm going to be hit with more taxation later. And you know that if the taxes come in and you don't like them at that point, it's like you already made a fully rational decision when you voted to impose these additional costs. So it's not exactly an unjustified instance of imposing something on you at that later time. Suppose you change your mind after you vote and you're like, never mind, I wish I hadn't voted that way. I wish the bill didn't pass because now I'm stuck with these higher taxes and I regret it. But you still gave your full and rational considered judgment to the vote. So if later on you're like upset about the outcome or the implications of it, it's already kind of locked in by your previous decision. So this is just another kind of example that could be used to illustrate the same point. So now anyway, in conclusion, Dworkin says that even if you're a strict libertarian and you really don't believe in paternalism and you believe that people should have as much autonomy as possible, even in the interest of autonomy, though, there could be some justified instances of paternalism, like when it's necessary to prevent you from losing your freedom, when it's the sort of restriction that you would probably authorize later afterwards, thank them for later, or when you already previously gave some kind of approval to the interference, like in the electoral case or in this Odysseus Sirens case. So he thinks fully rational individuals would probably agree to having these type of restrictions imposed on them for the reasons that were all mentioned. So in the end, what's this got to do with the whole drug topic? He thinks that recreational drug use is one of those things that interfering in someone's free access to could be an example of preventing a person from undergoing some irrevocable process of addiction, which might destroy their mental and physical capacities. And even if they said after they were addicted that they wanted to keep doing them, this might not be expressive of their fully rational will. Presumably fully rational individuals, he thinks, would consent to such limitations. But, it doesn't eliminate all the problems with this argument, because obviously, even on his analysis, it's not clear then how we could avoid ruling out all ultra-hazardous activities, like, say, free climbing on a mountain or, sort of drag car racing or something that poses significant risks just for the sake of recreational entertainment and pleasure. His sort of solution to that, and I think I mentioned this in passing last time, was that he suggests only allowing interference in cases where the restriction is trivial and does not play an important role in the life or identity of the person. So he thinks that that would safely include the restrictions on access to recreational drugs, but it would no longer apply to things like, if I'm identified as a mountain climber, and that's a constitutive part of my personality and identity, then that's something he doesn't think should be restricted. But I still find that a little bit problematic because, again, recreational drug use, there's a whole, subculture, counterculture, which kind of celebrates and prioritizes that as like a big feature of a person's identity. So how do we distinguish that fine line between hazardous recreational activities that somehow inform the person's sense of self versus the recreational drug using that he thinks could be set aside for the sake of restrictions on liberty that protect your autonomy or whatever. In the end, he says that the easiest cases to handle would be those which can be argued about not just in terms of a concern for the person's own happiness or welfare, but for the autonomy and freedom of the person. Would be most likely to consent to those type of interventions because it would actually safeguard our freedom. Nonetheless, though, he kind of closes on a cautionary note that we should guard against any unjustified interference in our liberties, and that means we have to place a heavy burden of proof on any authorities that want to propose a restriction to demonstrate the exact nature of the harmful or beneficial effects to be either avoided or achieved, and also the proposed restriction should be the least restrictive alternative to achieve the proposed interference. So, like, for example, suppose that you don't want people to use drugs because you think it's going to, curtail their autonomy if they become addicted. So the penalty you impose on it is like the death sentence. I mean, that would, of course, he thinks be a little bit excessive. So he thinks whatever restrictions on liberty that we impose through legal means should be the least restrictive that's essential to achieving whatever benefits or policy goals. So then that's the end of a whole drug unit, and it takes us on to the next thing. So I'm just skipping ahead in my notes a little bit. And so we have just like a little miniature unit that's just 2 lessons, this today and Thursday. After that, we're going to be focused next week on our midterm review session on Tuesday, and then there's going to be the exam next Thursday. And I'll be mailing like a detailed set of instructions about that. Some of it's already been put in our syllabus earlier, but I'm going to post another announcement just to clarify it again. As well, I don't want anyone to forget, I have received all your essays, yes, except for, did Sandra give me hers? Let's see. I still don't see it in my inbox. So wait, maybe let me check in my inbox. Yeah, so Sandra Alviar, I know you're here in the chat, or you were earlier. So just don't forget to give me that. I need your essay. Otherwise, I can't give you a grade. Anyway, though, to everybody, I'm sending you back your comments and scores before the end of the day on Saturday. So that's my imposed deadline, and you'll definitely get your results before then, probably Friday. But worst case, it's going to be on Saturday, and you're going to receive an email from me. So just keep your eyes on your inbox, and you're going to be notified with comments, scores, and all kinds of good details about your first essay assignment by the end of this Saturday. Okay, but anyway, we're continuing, and our next big topic is genetic engineering and human cloning. So these interesting and totally new biotechnologies. There are some ethical questions, of course, raised around this type of biotechnology, and we're just going to explore and understand the debate. Genetic engineering and cloning, this class is called contemporary moral issues. The word contemporary means like today or in modern times. And, a lot of the subjects we're looking at, they do have, something to do with current day debates. But out of all of them, I would say this is perhaps the most truly contemporary of the moral issues we're studying, because it's really only become an issue that we can even contemplate with the advent of genetic engineering and cloning, which is a recent historical phenomenon in technology. There were no people in 1800 or 1900 even thinking about this, because the means by which to do it didn't exist yet. So we're some of the first people in human history. We are the first people really in human history to even think about the issues that are being raised here. And so this biotechnology is moving at a fast pace. In a way, it's moving so fast that our ethical intuitions are not fully settled yet. Even our ethical intuitions about this topic is kind of slow to take hold, so they might not be fully formed or established just yet. Some of the basic moral problems with the technology involve like whether it is playing God. So if we manipulate genetic information to either treat disease or to even enhance people, is that playing God? To alter genes to treat or prevent disease? Would it be permissible to use the technology to enhance human beings, not just to treat diseases or disabilities? Should we use this type of eugenic intervention into the human genome to improve the human race? Or is there something morally wrong or impermissible about that? And of course, we could also ask the question whether it's permissible to clone a human being. What could be the reasons to want to clone a human being? Well, there's a couple of possible benefits that could result from that. One is in order to give an infertile couple the potential to have a genetically related child. So suppose that there's a couple that wants to have a child, but they don't have the ability to do it naturally because one of the two of them or both are infertile. If you're infertile, you could bypass the sexual reproduction process by cloning one of the two parents, and then you would have a genetically identical copy of them that you could raise as a child. So one application of the cloning thing is that it could give people that are otherwise infertile a chance to have a genetically related child instead of, say, having to adopt or take on the custody of someone they're not genetically related to. Another thing is that it could also allow you to avoid passing a genetically inheritable disease to a child. Suppose that there was a couple and one of them has like a genetically inheritable disease that they don't want to transmit to their offspring. You could bypass their genes entirely by cloning the other partner, and then that way you'd make sure that they didn't have, those problems that the one progenitor would have had. But anyway, we'll talk more about that as we continue. I'm just opening our notes on the topic. So let's begin with the whole question of what is gene therapy? What's gene therapy? This part is just going to be me sort of filling you in on some of the scientific background about what this technology actually are or is. So we start off by just mentioning cells. Cells are the little building blocks of living organisms, as you might know from your studies in biology if you've had any of that. DNA is what makes up the chemical code that directs the construction, development, and the operation of living cells. You can think of DNA as a set of like coded instructions. It's kind of almost like the software or computer language that runs the cells and transmits our inherited traits from one generation to the next. In every living organism, from the tiniest little fly to full-blown human or other organism, no matter what diverse organisms we're talking about, DNA consists of the same chemical ingredients and structure. And what is that structure? So the structure of DNA is like a double helix, which kind of has the visual look of a twisted spiral staircase, like say that. And So it's a double helix, meaning that there are these parallel twisted strands, and they're linked together by chemical crossbars at the various positions along the double helix. Each crossbar is formed by a matching pair of chemical bases, which we call base pairs. And surprisingly, perhaps, there's only 4 base proteins. So here are the 4 chemical bases in the DNA sequence. So we have, first of all, adenine, that's A. Cytosine, which is labeled with C, of course. We just use the first letter of each protein as its general label. Adenine, cytosine, guanine is G. And then finally, thymine, which is T. So the order that these base pairs occur in is known as the DNA sequence. And the DNA sequence that you have encodes all the instructions for making and sustaining a given organism. A cell in your body, for example, constructs proteins in accordance with the code that it reads from the genetic sequence. And these proteins then carry out processes and provide the building materials for the cell. Now, your entire DNA sequence or DNA structure or of any organism is known as its genome. The human genome consists of 3 billion base pairs, and the complete genome of the human being occurs in almost every single cell in your body. The cells in your body read, quote unquote, these base pairs not as one long string of letters, but rather as chunks or words, you could call them, where each segment provides instructions for the cell to make proteins. Now, so we have 3 billion base pairs, but they're organized into larger bundles. These larger bundles are what we call genes. You can think of them as the words of the genetic code sequence. The human genome contains about 20 to 25,000 genes, and the length of the base pair instructions for each one varies. Each gene in you has a duplicate, one each from your mother and your biological mother and biological father. In the nucleus of each cell in the body, the genes are organized into bundles furthermore. So we have the base pairs, which are organized into genes, and then the genes are furthermore organized into bundles known as chromosomes. There's 46 chromosomes. Those 46 chromosomes are further organized into 23 pairs. Sorry. Not to worry. Hey there, Jason. Good to see you. So the base pairs, the 3 billion of them, are organized into bundles known as genes. The genes are then further organized into 46 sets of chromosomes, which are then organized into 23 pairs. 22 of those pairs are the same for men and women, but the 23rd differs, where men biologically have an X and a Y chromosome, while females biologically have 2 X chromosomes. And that's what determines, at least genetically, your biological sex. Now, this labyrinth of genetic information is how the human organism is produced and sustained, and how individual characteristics are determined. So, like, why do you have the hair color, eye color, etc., that you have? It all has to do with the information encoded in your genes, chromosomes, etc. Now, when this system is working as it should, the organism is healthy. But if there's a genetic mutation, which can sometimes happen, then that can lead to devastating diseases or disabilities. Some genetic mutations are acquired from the environment, either randomly or through exposure to toxic agents like radiation, chemicals, or smoke. Other mutations are not environmental, but are hereditary, meaning that they're coming from your inheritance genetically. And when you have those mutations, the same mutations can be triggered and same diseases can reoccur in future generations or offspring. Now, of course, some genetic disease arises from a combination of both environmental and hereditary factors, but those are the two kind of components that can lead to these mutations that cause genetic disease. So naturally, we're human beings, and human beings, we're so smart that we don't just sort of lie down and accept that we have diseases and disabilities. We invent solutions, strategies, medicines, therapies to try and counteract those things. The same way that we have vaccines to try and prevent certain diseases from proliferating or from making people too sick to survive. The same way that we have like all kinds of surgical interventions, whether it's organ transplants or blood transfusions. human beings have developed all kinds of interesting biotechnological and medical strategies to overcome the threats that nature imposes on us, including these. So the next step in this case is to try and repair the genetic flaws that we see in some, unfortunate people that have those illnesses. When we do try to repair the genetic information, that's known as gene therapy, or sometimes it's called genetic engineering. So let me write down a definition given in our text of gene therapy / genetic engineering. Gene therapy is the manipulation of someone's genetic material to prevent or treat disease. Okay, so just getting a baseline definition there of this biotechnology, genetic therapy, or some just call it genetic engineering. But I think therapy is probably the better label because it has to do with like the medical intervention with a disease or a disability. So there's 3 specific ways that this type of gene therapy can be achieved. So 3 ways that it's done, 3 forms. So number 1 could be replacing a missing or defective gene with a normal one. Replacing a missing or defective gene with a normal one. Okay, that's one method by which this can be achieved. A second out of 3 is repairing a faulty gene so it works properly. And then a third means by which we can use this genetic therapy is to activate or deactivate a gene. Okay, so sometimes the issue is that there's a gene in there that's not working properly, or it's missing. And in that case, we can sometimes deliver a replacement gene that has the correct function. And that would be number 1. Number 2, so there's replacement, there's repair, and then there's activation or deactivation. So sometimes we don't need to fully replace it. We can just repair the genetic information inside. In a third case, there might be a gene that has that's producing too much of a certain protein and it has to be turned off, or we need to activate a gene that ought to be producing a certain protein, so we'll turn it on. So there's those 3 cases: replacement, repair, or activation / deactivation. So far, most gene therapy has been of the first kind, which is to insert a normal copy of a gene into cells to do the work that either defective or missing genes ought to be doing. But delivering a gene to a cell is not 100% perfected. It's difficult. And how do we do that? Usually it's done by means of the carrier, which is a virus. So viruses, about them, the way they work is that they seek out certain cells in the body and then they transfer pieces of their DNA into them. So like if you get a viral illness or something, this is what's happening. You have a virus that's now attacking certain cells in your body, transferring pieces of its DNA into them and modifying, distorting, or warping their ordinary functioning, which produces like an illness. So scientists can harness this capacity of a virus to inactivate its harmful properties and then modifying it so that it just becomes a carrier to deliver specified genes into designated cells. So like, the virus in the ordinary course is something that will make you sick, but geneticists and scientists have found a way to like remove its harmful properties and just use it as a vehicle to deliver genes to certain cells in the body. Once it does that, the genes can then cause the production of proteins that are needed to restore normal functioning. One example of this, to just mention, is the treatment of hemophilia. I don't know if you're aware of what hemophilia is, but it's a genetic disease in which a person doesn't produce the necessary proteins in their blood that have to do with clotting, blood clots. So if you had hemophilia and you suffered like a bad cut or whatever, you could just bleed out and die because the blood never coagulates or clots in the normal case as it would for a healthy person. So again, that problem is caused by a genetic mutation in genes that manufacture proteins that are necessary for clotting the blood. So scientists, when they've used gene therapy to treat that, they'll use these virus carriers to transfer normal copies of those genes into the cells, which enable the production of the blood clotting proteins. Now, there's also two types of gene therapy in terms of what cells are involved. So two types of gene therapy. The other three are like three mechanisms by which gene therapy can be achieved. But there's also two types of therapy, furthermore, depending on which cells are involved. So there's somatic cell gene therapy, and on the other hand, there's germline cell. So somatic cell gene therapy alters genes in a person's somatic cells, which are body cells. So those are just cells within the body or tissues or organs. We alter genes in a person's somatic cells, like say, for example, liver or muscle cells to treat a disorder. In somatic cell gene therapy, it helps the affected person, but those alterations are not inheritable, so they can't be transmitted to, say, one's offspring. In germline cell therapy, we modify genes in egg or sperm cells or zygotes, and in those cases, the alterations are inheritable to whatever offspring are produced by those individuals where the therapy was used. So right now, the germline therapy is the more controversial, and it's not as well tested. There's a lot of concern in a way about it because on the one hand, it does hold out the hope of eliminating certain diseases and certain mutations from future generations, like eradicating a disease once and for all. But also some people are concerned that if it was to be mistaken or done in error, that it could introduce genetic defects that would be inheritable on to the next generations. And some people worry about like nightmare scenarios where we've irrevocably modified the human genome in a way that is worse. But the promise of such safe and effective therapies, at least in the future, is what drives research forward and development of the biotechnology. To make the therapy effective, certain technical problems have to be solved. For one, it's difficult to perfectly well control those virus carriers to get them to accurately deliver genes to cells. And the risk of the virus carrier also is that it could cause a bad immune system response. Like the body could interpret this not to be a part of its own system, but some foreign element that it then attacks. And that's something that can sometimes happen. So it depends on whether the virus carrier is interpreted as like some kind of hostile virus that the body then wants to, again, have an overactive immune response to, which can end up harming the person. But that doesn't always happen. It's just something that can happen. So it's a sort of risk. The field is therefore still experimental. There's lots of studies out there and clinical trials, but there have been few therapies that have been approved for widespread use. Nonetheless, scientists in the field do believe that safe and effective gene therapies of at least the somatic cell kind are coming soon. And there's different stories. There's success stories, and then there's some maybe tragic disappointments. As a success story, consider the case in 1990, researchers conducted the first federally approved study which treated a 4-year-old girl who was suffering from a genetic deficiency that caused her to have a weaker immune system. In the girl, a certain gene was missing. So a virus carrier delivered the normal ADA gene, is what it was called, to her immune cells, and it worked, and it gave her a normal immune system after that. But not every case is a happy ending. As a failure example, consider that in 1999, 18-year-old Jesse Gelsinger had multiple organ failures and died during gene therapy because his immune system had an intensely negative reaction to the virus carrier. And so because of this and other negative outcomes, the FDA suspended clinical trials that use those procedures, but over time, some of them have been resumed with closer government oversight. A lot of the moral questions about gene therapy focus on its potential to either hurt or harm or to help people. In somatic therapy, the risks are the primary moral concern, but if the harm could be mitigated, if there could be some established procedures by which it's definitely safe, then that would help to dispel some of the moral concerns. With germline therapy, though, it's not as well understood, so it's generally thought unacceptable at this time for more widespread applications. Scientists don't yet fully understand the consequences of changing the genes of germline cells. And worse, people worry about disorders that are introduced that could then be passed on into the future. Let me read a little bit on page 318 about that, where it says some things about this. So. So it says here, germline therapy is a different matter. The safety concerns surrounding the technology are so worrisome that, at least in its current immature stage, it's generally thought to be morally unacceptable. The main problem is that scientists don't yet fully understand the likely ramifications of refashioning the genetic machinery of germline cells. The addition or modification of genes might make a condition worse or prevent one disease but cause others that are more severe. The result could be catastrophic or fatal to a child born of such engineering, and the calamities could happen at birth or years later. Worse, the resulting disorders could be passed on to future children. And the nightmare scenario is that genetic changes would be inherited by many people and the human genome itself altered for the worse. These unknowns have compelled scientists not to renounce the research, but to proceed with extreme caution and to forego trials until the genetics of germline cells are better understood. Other arguments about this, for or against it, don't focus on harm itself, but just assume that the technology will one day be safe. The argument in favor of it says, if we can correct genetic flaws in a way that's safe and effective, wouldn't we be obligated to do that? Wouldn't that be just an extension of current medical science and its goal of like relieving people of disabilities or diseases? Some also say that if reproductive liberty is a part of our autonomy, shouldn't that give us the right to decide if our offspring will have a disability or disease? So if we could correct it by means of genetic engineering, shouldn't parents be having access to that so that they can ensure that their children are as healthy and successful as possible? Opponents, on the other hand, would oppose that by saying that reproductive freedom is not unlimited and that germline therapy shows perhaps a lack of proper concern for human life itself, but we'll get to that as we expand on the topic. Next thing we'll talk about is the reproductive cloning, human cloning. So, because this is a twofold topic, genetic engineering and human cloning, both forms of biotechnology that involve manipulation of genetic material. So clones, what are they? They're genetically identical entities. It's possible to have cloned cells at the cellular level, or DNA molecules, or entire organisms. Like you can clone a whole plant, a whole animal, or at least in theory, even though it hasn't yet been done, you could clone a human being. Cloning means, let me type in the chat the definition that's written. It's the asexual production of a genetically identical entity from an existing one. So cloning. Okay, so there you see that definition provided there. Cloning is the asexual production of a genetically identical individual from an existing one. So it's not a fusion of sperm and egg, like that's sexual reproduction, as you know. Cloning involves something different from that, which I'm going to expand on and give you full detail. But it's not the joining of male and female gametes. It's asexual production of a genetically identical copy of an already existing organism. In animals and humans, the genetic blueprint for the entire individual is in the nucleus of each cell in the body. So like, you know, if we swabbed your cheek and we just collected one random cell from some part of you like that, it would contain within it the entire genetic sequence of you. And in agriculture, for example, the cloning of plants is quite common. If we want to clone certain, you know, fruits or vegetables to have desired characteristics, that's something that's commonly done within agricultural cloning. We sometimes clone individual human or animal cells for research purposes too. There are also naturally occurring clones. Those are identical twins. You know, I have triplet siblings. 2 of them are identical, so I have some real life experience with that, but I'm sure a lot of you either known twins or at least know about the concept. So twins are naturally occurring clones, meaning that they're occurring in a way that's not done in a lab. Scientists, though, can artificially induce such twins, by a process in an in vitro fertilization clinic known as twinning. How that works is you produce an embryo in a petri dish, and when it consists of just 2 to 4 cells, you can then actually separate them, and then they will grow into distinct copies. So if you like really wanted to have twins, and you were able to like form a zygote from like a sperm and egg cell of 2 progenitors, then you could induce twinning in that way. And that's something that sometimes people actually do. But the most controversial type of, oh, that's cool, Jasmine. Yeah, twin brother. Yeah. So Danny, David, my other brothers, they're both identical. I look a lot like them too. I'm only a year older than them, but you know, I'm the first one. Anyway, though, the most controversial type of cloning would be to create a genetic duplicate of an adult animal or human, and that's known as reproductive cloning. To create a genetic duplicate of an adult organism. That's different from therapeutic or research-based cloning. So, for example, in 1997, everyone became aware of this procedure because that's when we cloned the first adult mammal, and it was a sheep named Dolly. So Dolly was the first mammal ever cloned, and since then, other animals have also been cloned. Now, what's the method that's used in reproductive cloning? It's called somatic cell nuclear transfer. So let me go ahead and tell you about what that is. So the process of cloning a organism, an adult organism, and creating an identical copy of them, genetically identical copy, it's called somatic cell nuclear transfer. I'm sorry, let me get a little drink. And there's 4 steps to that. Okay, so let's go through the 4 steps of somatic cell nuclear transfer. The first step is, so you basically take the nucleus out of an egg cell. Okay, so that's step 1. Maybe to give you a little visual, just use the board a little bit, not too much. But we're talking about somatic cell nuclear transfer, the procedure that's used to reproductively clone. Okay, so you see the written description there in the chat, and I'm just going to kind of give you a little visual. So step 1, say that you had an egg cell. Like an egg cell that's ovulating in a woman's body or whatever. We can extract the nucleus of that. So we take the nucleus out, and then it becomes a denucleated egg cell without that nucleus in the middle. Okay, so we remove the nucleus from an egg cell. Now it's hollowed out, just shell of an egg cell. Then we get to step 2. So step 2 of this process is we replace that nucleus with the donor nucleus of a normal body cell from the adult that we want to clone, or an embryo. Okay, so but we'll just assume it's going to be an adult here. So step 2, replace the nucleus with the nucleus from a body cell of an adult that you want to clone. So we get a nucleus donor to give us one nucleus from one of their body cells, and we place that inside of the now hollowed out denucleated egg. So step 2 would be like, we take this other nucleus now, and we input it into the previously removed denucleated egg cell. So now it's been renucleated. There's like a new nucleus in that egg cell, but it's not its original nucleus. It's the nucleus from whatever donor that we want to clone. Okay, so hope I haven't lost you yet. We had an egg cell that was used. Its nucleus was removed. It became empty. Then we inserted into it a different nucleus from a different individual, or actually it could be the same individual. We'll get to that. But anyway, we put another nucleus in there from the body cell of some like adult organism. Then we get to step 3. Step 3 is simply we then electrochemically stimulate the cell so that it starts to undergo mitosis, which means cellular division, and then it starts to develop into an embryo. So we stimulate the cell to initiate cell division and growth to an embryo. Okay, so at the 3rd step, I mean, there's no easy way for me to draw this because it's a much more technical process than what my hand could possibly draw. But, now that we have this egg with a new nucleus in it, we use electrochemical stimulation, just trying to draw some little lightning type zigzags. And then it starts to divide, and we start to see cellular division happening inside of it, okay? Now it's become an embryo. So it's a cloned embryo. We then, 4th and final step, we then simply will transfer the cloned embryo to the host uterus for gestation and birth, and then 9 months later, we're going to give birth to whoever donated. Well, we're going to give birth to a clone of whoever donated the nucleus at step 2. Okay, so that's the 4th and final step. Transfer the cloned embryo to a host uterus for gestation and birth. Okay, so that in 4 steps. Well, the fourth step, I don't know if I can really draw it, but we're going to take this now, dividing, you know, embryo really, and implant it in like a woman's body. Um, Now it's in there, and it's going to start developing. And 9 months later, she's going to give birth. So like this goes into her body, obviously into the womb. 9 months later, she's going to give birth, and she's going to give birth to a genetic copy, like an identical twin, basically, of whoever provided this nucleus donation. The egg and the nucleus can come from two different people, which would be the most, I think, typical case, but it could also come from the same person. If the egg and the donor nucleus is from the same person, then it's a clone of themselves. And this person is going to give birth to a baby, of course, but it's going to be a baby that's a genetic copy of themselves. So it would be like, you're a twin, but they're not born like a couple minutes after you. They're born however many years later once you become a mature adult, and then you clone yourself. If that was the same egg and nucleus donor. But of course, if the egg cell has been hollowed out and it's another donor that gives the nucleus, then it's just going to be a clone of them. So suppose we wanted to clone Professor Vulich, me, you could take one cell out of my body, remove its nucleus, insert it into the emptied out nucleus of some woman's egg cell. And it doesn't even have to be the same woman who provides the egg cell that we implant it into. But once we stimulate it into cellular division, we then implant that embryo into some woman's uterus, and then it starts to gestate and it develops. And then when she gives birth, she'll give birth to a genetic copy, again, of the nucleus donor. Mm-hmm. Now, the nucleus of the cell would determine the vast majority of the clone's DNA, with a little bit of mitochondrial DNA in the outer rim, but it doesn't make a major contribution to your overall genetic information. So far, as of today, 2025, no human being has ever been cloned yet. Because right now, scientists and even politicians and ethicists have certain concerns about the safety and the ethics of the procedure. Now, some of these concerns are based on misunderstanding. Like, for example, some people think it's a little bit of a naive idea, but some people think that this clone is an exact copy of the parent. So maybe this could enable people to make like an army of Hitlers or an army of Einsteins. We just want to engineer a bunch of genius people. Let's make a clone of Michael Jordan so that we get another copy of him coming out. That'll be, another amazing basketball player. But that obviously isn't so straightforward. The idea of genetic determinism is false. But let me ask anybody why you think that might not be true. Why do you think if we say cloned, Einstein, it's not necessarily true that that would be another genius scientist, or that if we cloned Michael Jordan, it wouldn't necessarily be like another kind of GOAT-like professional basketball player, or that if we cloned Hitler, it wouldn't necessarily be like a anti-Semitic, power-hungry dictator type of individual. What is the reason you could think of as to why, even if we had a genetic copy, it wouldn't necessarily be exactly the same in all personality and so forth, or even interests? Yes, Mary Jane, experiences in life can change who we are, right? So there's an obvious contribution to who you are from your environment. Environmental factors will influence the developmental qualities of the clone, correct? So like if we cloned Einstein today, he'd be growing up in this century with a whole different set of environmental factors, the internet and everything else. So his mind would probably, take a different course. But at the same time, he would have the genetic predisposition to be that intelligent. He would have all the genetic basis to like live out that type of identity, but it wouldn't be a certainty. Just in the same way that two identical twins are not always the same type of people. I know our student above, Jasmine, was talking about how you have a twin brother, and I don't know if it's a boy and a girl. I guess it has to be fraternal, so it can't be quite identical, but it's very genetically similar anyway. And speaking from the experience of my own, the two twin brothers that I have in this set of triplets that I'm siblings of, they're quite different, people. They have some things in common, but they're actually quite different in their taste, personality, and habits. So even when you do have like genetically identical copies and they're growing up at the same time, like twins are, they're not going to necessarily be the same. So the idea that it opens the door to a possible future where, we engineer back into existence people from the past, it's not exactly like going to be that straightforward, and it's just a kind of science fictional, dystopian, overhyped fear. But those supportive of cloning do point to its possible benefits. Let me read a note from the book on this last thing. It says here, a typical response to the prospect of human cloning is moral outrage, which often is based on misunderstandings. Chief among these is the notion that a human clone would be identical to an existing person, the clone's parent. This idea has led to a host of silly fantasies played out in movies, literature, and the popular mind. An army of Hitler clones, spawned from one of the Fuhrer's cells, a laboratory of Albert Einstein's discovering the secrets of the universe, the perfect team of Michael Jordan clones. The underlying fallacy is that genes are the entire basis that make the person, that genetics ordains all of an individual's characteristics. This is known as genetic determinism, and it is a myth. The National Academy of Sciences explains it this way. Even if clones are genetically identical with each other, they will not be identical in physical or behavioral characteristics because DNA is not the only thing that determines those characteristics. A pair of clones will experience different environments, different nutritional inputs while in the uterus, and they would be expected to be subject to different inputs from their parents, society, and life experience as they grow up. If clones derived from identical nuclear donors and identical mitochondrial donors were born at different times, as is the case when an adult is the donor of the somatic cell nucleus, the environmental and nutritional differences would be expected to be more pronounced than for identical twins. And even identical twins are not fully identical genetically or epigenetically because mutations, random developmental variations, and varied imprinting effects make different contributions to each twin. And so in closing, the book says Einstein's clone would have Einstein's genes, but would not and could not be Einstein. The clone would be unique and probably not much like his famous progenitor at all. So yes, that we got that part out of the way. But those that are supportive of the technology or prospect of it point out to its possible benefits. And as I mentioned, what are the possible benefits of cloning? So let's go ahead and list those in the chat really quickly. Okay, so one of them was mentioned as providing people an opportunity to have a genetically related child if they were otherwise infertile. Okay, so providing people an opportunity to have a genetically related child if they could not do so. Now, why might they be not able to do so? There's a number of possible reasons. One, of course, is just straight up infertility. Some people experience fertility issues and they cannot successfully become pregnant or impregnate. And in those cases, we could definitely clone an individual, whether it's the mother or father in that couple, and make sure that they did have a genetically related child. That'd be a genetic copy of one of the two. So they would have a child in the world that they thought, is an inheritor of their genetic information. Another case is people that have moved beyond their childbearing years. Maybe there's people who found themselves in a situation desiring to have a genetic child, a genetically related child, and they've gone past the years where, let's say, the woman in the couple had the ability to produce offspring any longer. She's maybe postmenopausal or whatever. Well, in that case, we could still ensure that, like, she even could have a genetically related child that's identical to her by cloning her. Another case is, suppose you could never find a partner in life and you don't want to just adopt someone else's genetically related child. Well, you could be a single parent and clone yourself, and in that way you'd be raising a clone, but it would be genetically related to you, of course, genetically identical to you. And that would provide an opportunity for people to have children that otherwise were not capable of doing it, either through infertility, aging out, or just not having a suitable partner. It could also be the only way to avoid passing a genetic disease to a child. So that's a second possible application or benefit. So let me just type this out carefully. So a second potential benefit or application would be that it could allow a couple to have a genetically related child without passing on a genetic disease to their offspring. So suppose that there was a partnership of two people, and there's one of the two that has like a genetic disorder, like say hemophilia that we mentioned earlier, so they don't produce that blood clotting protein. Well, we could bypass their genetic information and just clone the other partner, and then would have a child that definitely didn't have any risks of inheriting those genetic disorders but they would still be genetically related to one of the two partners. I guess also if you had same-sex couples that wanted to have a genetically related child without going into surrogacy or something like that, this would be another application, just to think about in terms of the first point mentioned above. There's also the possibility of cloning tissues or organs for transplant purposes. So now this is interesting, but okay. So like, as you guys maybe know, sometimes when a person has a certain type of serious disease, they may need to get a organ transplant in order to like survive. And the thing is, these transplants, they work successfully and everything's fine. But in other cases, the body doesn't really take the transplanted organ because it can sometimes interpret it again as though it's something that the body needs to attack with its immune system, as though it's a foreign element in their body. So getting it to not reject the organ is a big part of the successful transplant process or procedure. Now, suppose though that a person wanted to get a transplant or needed to get a transplant, and they didn't want to have the risk that the body would reject it. If we cloned their organs, which is potentially something that could be done through the technology, then when we transplanted the cloned organ, the body would not think that it's something different because it would have the exact same genetic information, so it would not be rejected. So imagine, if this technology were totally perfected and safe, that you had like a full set of spare organs just waiting at like a medical facility that you've already had cloned, so that in case these things were ever necessary, like you've got a heart ready to go or another liver or kidney, whatever, and it would definitely ensure that there wouldn't be any risk of rejection from the body because it would be thought as the same genetic code. And finally, I mean, and this one's a little weird, but the book mentions it, so let's just go there. You could clone a copy of a deceased individual for whatever reason. You might want to do that. So okay, so there's like these four basic, possible benefits or applications. Say that parents, right, set of parents had a child, and tragically something happened to this child in their early years. Like, I don't know, they died randomly through an accident or something when they were like 2 or 3 years old. And suppose they just feel so like sorrowful for the loss of that person that they wish they could have another try with someone that exactly corresponds to their memory of that person. Well, they could clone the deceased individual. And of course, like we said earlier, genetic determinism doesn't determine everything about you. But at least from the visual aspect and the genetic aspect, this would be a copy. So some people might find comfort in the thought that, in case some tragedy, God forbid, were to happen, we could revive the likeness at least and the genetic copy of some person. As weird as that may sound to some of you, and I find it a little bit odd too, because you're thinking, well, why don't they just have a different child or whatever? But I don't know, it's something that some people may want to do. And this actually has happened with pets. So some people that are very wealthy actually will pay large sums of money to have a clone of, like, say, their house cat or dog. If they've had it for 20 years and they just can't bear to lose them, then they think they're getting round two, with another exact genetic copy. And the same thing has to do with like environmental effects that determine their identity and personality and stuff. But there would be the underlying genetic similarities that would make them predisposed to be quite similar. So, there's a fourth possible application. And so about reproductive liberty, there's a quote in the book that's related to this current point, and I'm just going to read it. It says here, many claim that a moral right to use cloning. Well, let me actually back up a little bit, and I'll read about this previous part. It says, as we would expect, many of those who favor the use of cloning rest their case on its potential benefits. For some people, their only hope of having a child with whom they are genetically related would be through cloning. Some men have no sperm, some women no eggs. Cloning could get around that problem. For couples who value this genetic connection and who also want to avoid passing on a genetic disease or health risk to their child, cloning would be an attractive or perhaps the only option. Parents whose only child dies could have her or them cloned from a cell harvested from their body, ensuring that some part of her would live on. A boy who needs an organ transplant to live could be cloned so his clone could provide the needed organ perfectly matched to avoid transplant rejection. Many claim a moral right to use cloning, arguing that people have a basic right of reproductive liberty and that cloning is covered by that or included by that right. They deny that this right to cloning is absolute, but believe that it carries great weight nonetheless. As one writer put it, Carson Strong. It's reasonable to hold that the freedom of infertile couples to use cloning is a form of reproductive freedom. Reproductive freedom is worthy of respect in part because freedom in general is worthy of respect, but more than this, reproductive freedom is an especially important freedom because of the significance that procreative decisions can have for people's lives. For these reasons, the freedom of infertile couples to use cloning is worthy of respect. But others see the process as somehow treating human beings like commodities to be edited for particular desires or purposes. Some think that that sort of dehumanizes individuals and makes them sort of just another aspect of like technology. Designer babies is another possible problem that we'll talk about when we get to the whole genetic enhancement debate. But this now is like our preamble to set us up for the discussion about the author's material. The author that we're going to launch into, and this is going to be the primary topic of Thursday's meeting, is John Harris. And his article is called The Beneficence Argument. It's called Is Gene Therapy a Form of Eugenics? Okay. So that's the author and the title. This paper is from 1999, and it's from the Journal of Bioethics. He makes an interesting argument. I mean, his position on the ethics of this is that it's not wrong he talks about genetic engineering more than the cloning thing. But he says with genetic engineering, his view is that there's nothing wrong with it. In fact, he would go even a stage farther. He would say that it should be a moral obligation to not just treat disease and disability with genetic engineering, but to enhance people to some greater levels of function beyond normal. And that's like a pretty controversial position to take, but that's his overall position in the paper. And we're going to try to understand why he's saying that and what his premises and reasoning is. So yeah, John Harris, he defends the moral permissibility of genetic enhancement, not just treatment or repair, but like, again, enhancement beyond normal. And he uses what's known as the beneficence argument for genetic enhancement. So we don't have a lot of time, but I'll just give you a couple of things to sort of preview this, and that'll help us to smoothly transition into the lecture on Thursday. Many people say gene therapy should not be permitted because it amounts to eugenics. What is eugenics? The deliberate attempt to improve genetic makeup by manipulating reproduction. The word eugenics carries a negative stigma because of its association with, like, for example, the horrors of Nazi Germany, where the regime tried to achieve racial purity by mandated sterilization of like undesirables on whatever racial basis. But he says eugenics actually does not only refer to such efforts as that. There's two different types of eugenics. There's negative and positive eugenics. Negative eugenics is to prevent or treat disease. Like, for example, prenatal screening could be considered negative eugenics if you identified in prenatal screening that some embryos that you had samples of were like unhealthy and others were healthier, and then you selected the healthier ones. You could call that a form of negative eugenics. Positive eugenics, though, is the attempt to improve on normal function, not just treat disease. It seeks enhancement. So let me make sure I get that definition out there, and then I think that'll be the last thing we have time for today, the distinction between negative and positive eugenics. So negative eugenics is negative eugenics, manipulation of genetic material to treat disease or disability. And then positive eugenics is manipulation of genetic material to enhance beyond normal levels of function. So this distinction between negative and positive eugenics is a big point within the ethical literature on this. Negative eugenics, again, it's just to bring a person back to normal levels of function, to restore them to normal levels of functioning and health. Positive eugenics is to bring you beyond a baseline of normality to actually have an enhancement. So like if we were going to treat someone that had hemophilia with gene therapy to cure that disease so that their blood clotting proteins work in the proper way, that would be negative eugenics. But if we, say, wanted to modify an embryo such that we encode within it that it's going to be more athletic, or more intelligent or have musical talent. There actually are aspects of the genome that encode for things like that. And suppose that a person opted for that, supposing that this technology was like available and everything, that would be positive eugenics, because it's not just to treat a disease or disability, it's to like optimize someone beyond what we call normal functioning. Now, this is a major distinction in the ethical literature on cloning and genetic engineering: enhancement versus repair. Many people think that repair of disease or disability is a requirement and that it's consistent with established medicine, because the process of like whether it's taking vaccines or medications or surgical interventions, that's to make someone function normally again, right? We intervene to try and make them function normal or heal them. But people are a little bit more suspicious about the morality of enhancement beyond normal. Some deny that there's any real distinction by making a general appeal to the concept of beneficence. Beneficence is benefiting people. And some say that if it's in your power to make someone's life better, whether you call that treatment of disease or disability or enhancement, wouldn't it be a good thing to do it, all things considered? Critics of this claim, though, counter that by saying that the technology would inevitably be used in a way that's unfair to give advantages to the wealthy and well-connected, so that if they had greater access to this type of enhancement than everyday people did, then that would give them even further advantages socially over other people in the world and in the competitive world that we're living in. Imagine that if we have the haves and the have-nots financially, but imagine if the haves and have-nots was also distinguished along genetic lines, so that the people with more money were actually using some of that money to make sure their children were smarter, healthier, more athletic, more talented, etc. So that's kind of the like moral landscape of this debate that we're now going to kind of dive into even farther on Thursday. As we're getting low on time, I think I'll have to close our stream for the moment, but let me see if anyone here in the chat could just hit me with your quick goodbye. And I appreciate everyone's attendance once again. We'll be back on Thursday at 4 o'clock, as always, to get into the next installment. Amanda, you say, a quick question. For the midterm, are the questions going to be chosen from the study guide? Yes. So thank you for your question. And let me just give you an answer really fast. When you get the test form, which is going to be posted right at 4 o'clock on the Thursday of the 13th next week, you're going to see that it's going to contain a set of questions from the study guide, but it's only going to be like 10 or 11 of them. And you're going to be asked to answer like about 7 or maybe 8 of those. So there's going to be a shortened, curated list that's taken from the master list of the study guide. So when you're studying the things on the study guide, you're studying the things that could potentially be the questions themselves. And you can formulate and prepare possible responses, obviously, in advance of the test. So yeah, you're right. It's not like that's just a topic list of things to think about, but those are literally the options that I will select from in terms of creating the test form. Okay. So hopefully that's a specific answer to your question. Okay, well, thanks everybody. And once again, have a great day and take it easy until Thursday. I'll be in touch with anyone. If you need me, you can always reach me. So, all right, then have another good one, and I'll see you on Thursday. Bye-bye. Thank you. By the way, Sam, I don't know if I got it. I'll check right now. And if I do have it, I'll let you know. Okay, thanks again. Bye.